At 85, Frank Perez sat on a cold Chicago sidewalk, his trembling hand extended not for pride, but for survival. Once a respected history teacher, now invisible to the world, he had been erased by the very son he raised. Rain fell steadily, blurring the line between tears and silence, until something small struck the pavement beside him. A coin, old, heavy, marked with a symbol he had only ever seen in ancient texts. Frank's breath caught, because in that moment something inside him whispered, "This was never meant to be lost." If you've ever felt forgotten, cast aside, or stripped of your worth, stay with this story. Some truths only reveal themselves when everything else is taken away. Before the world reduced him to a quiet figure on a wet sidewalk, Frank Perez had lived a life built on purpose, small, steady, and deeply rooted in dignity. For over 40 years, he had stood at the front of a classroom in a modest public high school on the west side of Chicago. His voice, calm, patient, and filled with quiet passion, had carried stories of ancient civilizations, forgotten empires, and the rise and fall of kings who believed their power would last forever. Frank never cared much for power. What he cared about was meaning. He believed history wasn't just about dates or wars. It was about choices, about people, flawed, fragile, hopeful people, trying to leave something behind that mattered. And in his own quiet way, Frank had tried to do the same. He had loved one woman his entire life, Elena Perez, his wife of 38 years. She had been warmth in human form, gentle, resilient, and endlessly patient with the world. When cancer took her, it didn't happen dramatically. It happened slowly, quietly, like a light dimming 1 inch at a time. Frank remembered holding her hand in that hospital room, her fingers already growing cold. "Take care of him," she had whispered. She meant their son. And Frank had promised. He always kept his promises. So when Elena was gone, Frank poured everything he had left into raising Miguel Perez. He worked longer hours, took on extra tutoring sessions, and sacrificed the little luxuries he never thought twice about before. New clothes became rare. Vacations disappeared. His world narrowed down to two things: his classroom and his son. Miguel had not been a bad child. That was the part that hurt the most. As a boy, he had been curious, energetic, always asking questions. Frank would come home exhausted only to find Miguel waiting with a book in his hand, asking about ancient Rome or the pyramids of Egypt. "Were kings always powerful?" Miguel once asked. Frank had smiled. "No," he said gently, "power isn't what makes a king. It's what they choose to do when they have nothing left." Miguel didn't understand then. Maybe he never would. As the years passed, something began to change. Slowly at first. Almost invisibly. Teenage frustration turned into quiet resentment. Questions turned into arguments. Gratitude faded into expectation. Miguel wanted more money, more comfort, more status, things Frank had never prioritized. "You spent your whole life teaching for pennies," Miguel snapped once during a heated argument. "What do you even have to show for it?" Frank had stood there stunned, not because of the words, but because of the emptiness behind them. "I have you," he said quietly. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt something shift. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure that was true anymore. Years later, after Miguel graduated and moved into the world, the distance between them only grew. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rare. Conversations became transactional. Then came the day Miguel returned, smiling confident, carrying ideas about helping his father. "You shouldn't be living alone at your age," Miguel said, walking through the small but well-kept house Frank had shared with Elena. "It's not safe. And honestly, it's outdated." Frank listened, uneasy but trusting. Miguel spoke of investments, of consolidating assets, of putting the house under his name for protection. He used words Frank wasn't entirely familiar with, spoke quickly, confidently, like someone who had already decided the outcome. "You trust me, don't you?" Miguel asked. That question, more than anything else, sealed it. Frank didn't hesitate. "Of course I do," he said. And he signed. At first, nothing changed, or at least nothing obvious. Miguel visited more often. He brought groceries, made small repairs, spoke about future plans. Frank allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was what Elena had meant. That his son was finally stepping into responsibility. But trust once misplaced doesn't break loudly. It dissolves, quietly. One morning, Miguel arrived earlier than usual. His expression was different, tight, impatient. "We need to talk," he said. There was no warmth in his voice, no hesitation, just a decision already made. Frank listened as Miguel explained coldly, efficiently, that the house had been sold, that arrangements had already been finalized, that Frank would need to leave. At least temporarily, Miguel added, though his tone suggested otherwise. Frank blinked, trying to process the words. "Sold," he repeated. Miguel sighed as if explaining something obvious to a child. "It was the best financial move. You don't understand these things. But this is my home," Frank said softly. Miguel didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was flat. Not anymore. The silence that followed was suffocating. Frank looked around the room, the walls that had held decades of memories, the small kitchen where Elena used to hum while cooking, the worn armchair where he had graded papers late into the night. Everything that had once defined his life now belonged to someone else. "You'll be fine," Miguel said, already moving toward the door. "There are shelters, services, people your age manage all the time. People your age, not my father." Frank didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't shout, because somewhere deep inside, something had already broken. He packed what little he could carry, a small suitcase, a few clothes, a photograph of Elena he refused to leave behind. When he stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should have. Neighbors glanced through windows but said nothing. Curtains shifted. Eyes watched. But no one came out. No one asked. No one stopped it. The door closed behind him with a quiet, final click. And just like that, Frank Perez ceased to exist in the life he had spent decades building. The days that followed blurred into each other. Shelters were overcrowded. Temporary help came and went. Pride, once a silent companion, slowly faded into necessity. Eventually, Frank found himself on that sidewalk, hand extended, eyes lowered. Not because he believed he deserved it, but because survival doesn't wait for dignity to catch up. And yet, even there, beneath the weight of betrayal, loss, and silence, a question lingered in the quiet corners of his mind. If a man loses everything, does that mean he was never worth anything to begin with? Frank didn't know the answer. Not yet. But somewhere deep beneath the surface of everything he had lost, something was still waiting to be found. The rain had passed by morning, but the cold remained clinging to the pavement, to the air, and to the bones of those who had nowhere else to go. Frank Perez sat in his usual spot along the edge of a busy Chicago street, his back pressed against the rough brick wall of a closed storefront. The city moved around him in a rhythm he no longer belonged to. Shoes clicked past. Voices rose and faded. Engines hummed. Life continued loud, indifferent, uninterrupted. And Frank existed quietly within it. The coin rested in his palm. He had not let go of it since the moment it struck the pavement beside him the night before. Even now his fingers curled protectively around it, as though afraid it might disappear if he loosened his grip. There was something about it, something he couldn't explain. Carefully, he opened his hand. In the gray light of early morning, the coin revealed itself more clearly. It was darker than ordinary currency, age-worn but not corroded. Its edges were uneven, almost handcrafted, and at its center, a symbol. Frank leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. It wasn't just a random marking, it was deliberate. A crown, stylized but unmistakable, sat above a crest that resembled a branching tree. Not the kind of symbol used in modern design, but something older, something ceremonial. His breath slowed, because he had seen it before, not in real life, but in books. Decades of teaching had filled his mind with images, artifacts, fragments of forgotten worlds. And somewhere, buried beneath years of routine and recent pain, something stirred. A memory. Royal insignias often survive longer than the kingdoms themselves. Frank had once told a classroom full of restless teenagers. They become symbols without context, clues without explanations. He swallowed. Now he was the one holding a clue. "Hey, what you got there?" The voice came from his left, rough, low, but not unfriendly. Frank turned slightly. A man sat a few feet away, wrapped in layers of worn clothing that had seen too many winters. His beard was thick, streaked with gray, and his eyes, sharp, observant, carried a kind of awareness that didn't match his outward appearance. This was Raymond Ray Collins. They had shared the same block for months now, though their conversations had been limited to nods, brief exchanges, and the occasional shared silence. Ray wasn't the kind of man who asked questions without a reason. Frank hesitated. Then slowly he extended his hand. Ray leaned in, squinting. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "What is it?" Frank asked. Ray didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted closer, lowering his voice as though the city itself might be listening. "That ain't no regular coin," he said. Frank gave a faint, humorless smile. "I figured as much." Ray glanced around, then back at the coin. "You know how many things people drop on these streets every day," he said. "Loose change receipts, junk, but something like this." He shook his head. "Nah, that don't just end up here by accident." Frank felt a flicker of something curiosity. maybe even hope, but he kept his voice steady. You think it's valuable? Ray shrugged. Could be. Could be nothing. Then he looked directly at Frank. But I've seen collectors pay real money for weird stuff like this. Old stuff. Foreign stuff. Foreign. The word echoed. Frank looked back down at the coin, his mind working now, not as a man defeated by life, but as the teacher he once was. He turned it over. On the reverse side, the design was even more intricate. Lines curved around the edges, forming a pattern that resembled script. Not English, not anything commonly used. His heart began to beat faster. I've seen this style before, he murmured almost to himself. Ray raised an eyebrow. Yeah. Where? Frank didn't answer right away, because the memory wasn't clear. Not yet. It hovered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue, like a dream fading too quickly to grasp. I used to teach history, Frank said, finally. Ray chuckled lightly. Used to, huh? Frank ignored the tone. There were references. He continued, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. Small mentions, footnotes mostly, about minor European dynasties that disappeared without records. No wars, no documented collapse, just gone. Ray leaned back slightly. And you think this is from one of those, I don't know, Frank admitted. But it feels connected. Ray studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Well, he said there's one way to find out. Frank looked up. Pawn shop down the street, Ray continued. Guy there deals in old coins sometimes. Might tell you if it's worth anything. Frank hesitated. The idea of walking into a place like that, of being judged, dismissed, wasn't unfamiliar. He had experienced enough of that already. But this felt different. This wasn't just about money. It was about meaning. Still doubt crept in. What if it's nothing? Frank asked quietly. Ray shrugged again, but this time there was something firmer in his voice. Then it's nothing, he said. You're right back where you started. He paused. But what if it ain't? Frank looked down at the coin once more. What if it isn't? The question lingered. For so long his life had been defined by loss, by things taken, erased, stripped away, without warning or explanation. But this was something found, unexpected, unexplained. And for the first time in what felt like years, Frank felt a small shift inside him. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. And curiosity, he knew, had always been the beginning of something greater. He closed his fingers around the coin again, this time not out of fear, but out of intention. I'll go, he said. Ray gave a short nod, satisfied. Good, he replied. Just don't let him lowball you. Frank almost smiled. Almost. As he slowly pushed himself to his feet, his body protesting with stiffness and age, he realized something subtle but undeniable. For the first time since he had been forced out of his home, he wasn't just surviving the day, he was moving towards something, even if he didn't yet understand what that something was. The city remained the same, loud, fast, indifferent. But Frank Perez stepped into it with a different weight in his pocket. And somewhere buried beneath years of silence and loss, the teacher in him had awakened again. The pawn shop sat wedged between a boarded-up laundromat and a flickering convenience store that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cheap cigarettes. Its windows were cluttered with mismatched items, old watches, tarnished jewelry, cracked guitars, forgotten pieces of other people's lives, each tagged with a price that rarely reflected its true story. Frank paused outside the door. For a moment, he saw his reflection in the glass. A thin man, shoulders slightly hunched, clothes worn and creased, eyes tired, but not empty. Not anymore. His hand instinctively tightened around the coin in his pocket. You've stood in front of classrooms filled with teenagers who didn't want to listen, he told himself quietly. You can walk into a shop. He pushed the door open. A small bell chimed overhead, sharp, metallic, announcing his presence with no regard for subtlety. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something older, something like neglect. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s, heavy-set with thinning hair slicked back and a permanent look of mild irritation carved into his face. This was Walter Briggs. Walter glanced up, briefly, his eyes scanning Frank from head to toe in less than a second. The judgment was immediate, practiced. Not a shelter, he muttered, not even pretending to lower his voice. Frank heard it. Of course he did. But instead of shrinking as he might have days ago, he simply stepped forward. I'm not looking for one, Frank said calmly. Walter raised an eyebrow, mildly surprised by the response. Then, what are you looking for? He asked, his tone skeptical. Frank reached into his pocket and carefully placed the coin on the glass counter between them. Walter barely glanced at it at first. Couple cents, he said dismissively. Take it somewhere else. Frank didn't move. I don't think so, he replied, his voice steady. Walter sighed loudly, clearly annoyed, but he picked up the coin anyway, more to prove a point than out of genuine interest. He turned it once, then again. His expression didn't change much, but something subtle shifted in his eyes. A flicker. He leaned closer, squinting. Where'd you get this? He asked. Found it, Frank answered. Walter snorted. Yeah, sure you did. But he didn't put the coin down. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small magnifying loupe, pressing it to his eye as he examined the surface more carefully. Seconds passed, then longer. The shop grew quieter, as if even the dust particles had decided to wait. Frank watched, not with desperation, but with quiet focus. Walter lowered the loupe slowly. It's fake, he said. Too quickly, too easily. Frank's gaze sharpened. You're sure? He asked. Walter shrugged, already setting the coin back on the counter. Seen plenty like it. Tourist junk, made to look old. But his fingers lingered on it just a fraction longer than necessary. Frank noticed. He had spent decades observing students learning to read. Hesitation, deflection, the small tells that revealed what words tried to hide. And Walter Briggs was hiding something. If it's fake, Frank said gently, then it wouldn't matter if I kept it. Walter's jaw tightened slightly. That's right. So you wouldn't mind if I walked out with it? Walter didn't answer immediately, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. Just then the door behind Frank opened again. The bell chimed. Both men turned. A woman stepped inside, mid-30s, composed, carrying herself with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and a leather satchel hung over her shoulder, worn but well cared for. Her eyes moved quickly around the shop, assessing, cataloging. This was Dr. Rachel Bennett. She wasn't here for Frank. At least not yet. I'm looking for antique coin sets, she said, her voice clear and professional as she approached the counter. Walter straightened slightly, shifting into a more accommodating posture. Got a few, he replied. Depends what you're after. Rachel nodded, but her attention had already drifted. Because she had seen the coin, it was still sitting there on the glass counter, partially obscured by Walter's hand. But not enough. Her eyes locked onto it, and in that instant, everything else disappeared. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the coin. Walter hesitated. Just for a second, but it was enough. Frank noticed. Rachel noticed. Even Walter noticed his own hesitation and didn't like it. It's nothing, he said quickly. Guy just brought it in. Fake. Rachel didn't look convinced. May I? She repeated, this time more firmly. Walter exhaled sharply, then slid the coin across the counter with a forced casualness. Knock yourself out. Rachel picked it up carefully. Not like a customer, like someone handling something significant. Her fingers traced the edges, the worn engravings, the symbol at its center. And then her entire expression changed, subtly, but undeniably. Her posture straightened, her eyes sharpened, her breathing slowed. Frank felt it, that shift in the room. What is it? He asked quietly. Rachel didn't answer right away. She turned the coin over, studied the reverse side. Her thumb brushed across the faint script. And when she finally spoke, her voice was no longer casual. Where did you say you got this? She asked. Frank met her gaze. I found it, he said again. This time she didn't dismiss the answer. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, not as a stranger, not as a man on the street, but as someone connected to the object in her hand. That's not possible, she murmured. Walter scoffed. Told you it's fake. Rachel ignored him completely. This symbol, she said softly, almost to herself, it shouldn't exist outside of archives. Frank's heartbeat quickened. What does it mean? He asked. Rachel hesitated, as if weighing something. Then she looked up again directly at Frank. It means, she said slowly, that if this coin is real, Iki, she paused. And in that pause, tension filled every corner of the room. Then it belongs to something the world believes no longer exists. Walter shifted uncomfortably. All right, that's enough, he muttered. It's just a coin. But his voice lacked conviction now. Rachel didn't take her eyes off Frank. This isn't just a coin, she said. It's a marker. Frank frowned. A marker for what Rachel's grip tightened slightly around the coin. For a legacy that was never supposed to be found. Silence fell again, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was heavy. Charged. Frank stood there, the weight of her words settling slowly into his mind. A coin. A symbol. A legacy. And somehow, it had found its way to him. Not by chance, not by accident, but by something far more deliberate. And for the first time since he had lost everything, Frank felt something he hadn't dared to feel in a very long time. Not hope, not yet, but something dangerously close to it. The word legacy did not leave the room when Rachel Bennett spoke it. It lingered, settling into the dusty corners of the pawn shop, threading itself through the silence between three people who suddenly understood that something far larger than a simple transaction had just begun. Frank stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the coin still resting in Rachel's hand. For decades, he had taught young minds about empires that rose and fell, about kings who believed their bloodlines would last forever, about relics that outlived the very civilizations that created them. But those had always been stories, distant, contained within textbooks. Now one of those stories was staring back at him in metal and shadow. "What do you mean, a legacy?" Frank asked, his voice quieter than before, but steadier. Rachel exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words with precision. "I mean," she said, turning the coin slightly so the light hit its surface, "this isn't just currency. It's a signifier, a token of identity, something that belonged to a very specific system of power." Walter scoffed from behind the counter. "Power," he muttered. "It's a scratched-up piece of metal." Rachel didn't even glance at him. "You've spent your career dismissing things you don't understand," she said flatly. "That doesn't make them insignificant." Walter opened his mouth to respond but stopped, because for once, he wasn't entirely sure he was right. Rachel returned her attention to Frank. "There are records," she continued, "but they're fragmented, incomplete. Most historians don't even agree on whether the kingdom in question truly existed." Frank's mind stirred again, reaching for pieces of knowledge long buried. "What kingdom?" he asked. Rachel hesitated. Then almost reluctantly she said, "A minor European dynasty believed to have existed somewhere along the border regions between modern-day Spain and southern France. It doesn't have an official name in most academic circles because its documentation is so inconsistent." Frank frowned slightly. "That's impossible," he said. "A kingdom, no matter how small, would leave a trace. Records, wars, trade routes. That's what makes this one different," Rachel replied. She placed the coin gently back on the counter, but her hand remained close to it, as if unwilling to let it go completely. "There are references to it appearing suddenly, and then disappearing just as abruptly," she said. "No clear origin, no documented collapse, just absence." Walter shook his head. "You're building a fairy tale out of scrap metal." Rachel turned to him, this time her expression sharp. "Then explain the crest," she challenged. "Explain the script. Explain the metallurgy that predates standard minting techniques from that region." Walter didn't respond, because he couldn't. Frank watched the exchange, his thoughts accelerating now, not in confusion, but in recognition. There was something about this that aligned with what he had once studied, something that had always felt unfinished, unresolved. "Why would something like this exist here?" he asked. Rachel looked at him again, and this time her gaze was different, more focused, more deliberate. "That's the question," she said. "Artifacts like this don't travel randomly. They follow lines, family lines, hidden, transfers, intentional placements." Frank felt a subtle chill run through him. "Are you saying this belonged to someone here?" he asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a question of her own. "Do you have any family history outside the United States?" she said. Frank blinked. The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "My mother used to talk about relatives in Spain, but it was never clear. Stories more than facts." Rachel's expression tightened slightly. What kind of stories? Frank hesitated. For years he had dismissed them, treated them as harmless myths, comforting perhaps, but ultimately meaningless. She used to say, "Our family came from something older," he said slowly, "that there was a past we didn't fully understand. But I always thought it was just imagination." Rachel didn't smile, didn't dismiss it. Instead, she leaned in slightly. "What if it wasn't?" she said. The question landed heavier than expected. Frank felt something shift inside him, not a full realization. Not yet, but a crack in the certainty he had lived with for so long. Walter cleared his throat loudly. "All right, enough of this," he said, his voice sharper now. "You want to buy it or not?" Rachel glanced at him briefly, then back at Frank. "This isn't something that should be sold here," she said. Walter's face hardened. "It's my shop, and that's your limitation," Rachel replied. The tension between them thickened. But Frank barely noticed, because his focus had narrowed to a single point: the coin, and what it might represent. "What do you think it leads to?" he asked Rachel. She took a breath. "A hidden lineage," she said. "Possibly one that was intentionally erased or protected." Protected from what, Frank asked. Rachel's eyes flickered. "From people who would misuse it," she said. "From history itself." The idea felt almost too large to grasp. Frank looked down at his hands, age-worn, marked by years of quiet labor and recent hardship. These were not the hands of someone important, not the hands of someone tied to power or legacy. And yet, the coin had found him. Not someone else, not a collector, not a scholar. Him. "Why me?" he whispered. Rachel didn't answer right away, because she didn't have a definitive answer, but she had a theory. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "these things don't go to the most powerful person or the most prepared." She met his eyes. "They go to the right one." Frank swallowed. The weight of that possibility pressed against everything he thought he knew about himself. For years, he had been defined by what he lost: his home, his dignity, his place in the world. But what if none of that erased who he truly was? What if it had only hidden it? Walter slammed his hand lightly against the counter. "This is ridiculous," he said. "It's just a coin." But his voice no longer carried authority, only frustration. Rachel picked the coin up again, then carefully placed it into Frank's hand. "You need to hold on to this," she said. Frank closed his fingers around it instinctively. "What happens now?" he asked. Rachel paused. Then, with quiet certainty, she said, "Now, we find out what it was never meant to reveal." Outside, the city continued its endless motion cars, passing people, rushing lives, intersecting without notice. But inside that small, forgotten pawn shop, a story had just begun to unfold. Not of kings sitting on thrones, but of a man who had been stripped of everything and was about to discover that he had never truly been empty. The coin felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning. Frank Perez walked beside Dr. Rachel Bennett through the late afternoon streets, his steps slower than hers, but steady, deliberate. The city still moved around them with its usual indifference, but something had changed within him. The noise no longer swallowed him whole. The cold no longer defined him. Because for the first time in years, Frank wasn't just reacting to life. He was following it. Rachel led him into a quiet building just a few blocks away, a university research annex tucked behind taller, more modern structures. It wasn't grand. No polished marble floors or towering columns, just old brick, narrow hallways, and the faint smell of paper and time. "This is where I work," she said as they entered. Frank glanced around. Shelves lined the walls filled with books, files, and storage boxes labeled in careful handwriting. There were maps pinned to corkboards, diagrams sketched across whiteboards, and tables covered with artifacts in various states of examination. It felt familiar, not physically, but intellectually, like stepping back into a part of himself he had abandoned. "You study coins?" Frank asked. Rachel gave a faint smile. "Not just coins," she said. "History leaves traces in many forms. Objects just happen to be the most honest ones." Frank nodded slowly. "Objects don't lie. People do." The thought lingered unspoken. Rachel gestured toward a chair near a long wooden table. "Sit," she said gently. "This might take a while." Frank lowered himself into the chair, his body still carrying the fatigue of years, but his mind now alert, engaged. Rachel moved with purpose. She pulled out gloves, a small scanning device, and a tray lined with soft fabric. Carefully, she nodded toward Frank. "The coin," she said. Frank hesitated. Not because he didn't trust her, but because something about letting go of it, even temporarily, felt significant. Still, he placed it in her hand. Rachel handled it with meticulous care, setting it on the tray and adjusting a small overhead light to illuminate its surface. "First, we document," she said. Frank watched as she began taking high-resolution photographs, capturing every detail: the edges, the crest, the faint script etched into the reverse side. Then she turned to the scanner. "This will help analyze the composition," she explained. "Metal composition can tell us a lot about origin." Frank leaned forward slightly. "Even something this old." "Especially something this old," Rachel replied. Minutes passed in focused silence. The machine hummed softly as it processed the data. Rachel's eyes moved between the coin and the screen, her expression tightening gradually, not with confusion, but with recognition. "That's not possible," she murmured. Frank's heart skipped. "What is it?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she ran the scan again, then a third time. Each result returned the same. Finally, she stepped back, exhaling slowly. "The alloy," she said. "It doesn't match any standardized minting composition from known European systems." Frank frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Rachel said, turning to face him fully, "this wasn't produced under conventional authority." Frank tried to process that. "So, not a kingdom." Rachel shook her head slightly. "No," she corrected. "If anything, it suggests something more controlled, more isolated, possibly even hidden." The word hung between them, hidden. Frank's thoughts drifted. Back to his mother. Back to the stories he had dismissed. Back to the quiet insistence in her voice when she spoke about their past. "You come from something older," she used to say. "Something that doesn't need to be seen to be real." He had never believed her. Not truly. Until now. Rachel walked over to a nearby cabinet and pulled out a thin folder, worn at the edges from years of use. "I didn't think I'd ever need this," she admitted as she opened it. Inside were photocopies of documents, old texts, partially translated manuscripts, sketches of symbols and crests. She laid one sheet beside the coin. Frank leaned in. The symbol matched. Not exactly, but close enough to erase any doubt. "That's it," he whispered. Rachel nodded. "This is the closest documented reference we have," she said. It's believed to represent a lineage that operated outside formal political systems. Why? Frank asked. Rachel's eyes darkened slightly. Because visibility makes you vulnerable, she said. Power that isn't seen is harder to destroy. Frank absorbed that. It made sense. In a world where kings were overthrown, where empires collapsed, where history rewrote itself again and again, the only way to survive completely was to disappear. Rachel turned another page. There's more, she said. Frank watched as she revealed a translated passage. The final ruler of this lineage, she read, is said to have dissolved the visible structure of the kingdom, scattering its resources and obscuring its bloodline to protect it from external threats. Frank's chest tightened. Scattered? How, he asked. Rachel looked at him. Through markers, she said. Frank's eyes dropped instinctively to the coin. His fingers curled slightly. No, he said quietly. You're not suggesting. I'm suggesting, Rachel interrupted gently, that this isn't just an artifact. She paused. It's a key. Silence filled the room. Frank felt it pressing in from all sides. A key. To what? To whom? He leaned back in his chair, his breath uneven now, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of possibility. This doesn't make sense, he said. I'm nobody. Rachel shook her head. No, she said firmly. You were made to believe you're nobody. The distinction hit harder than expected. Frank looked at her. What are you saying? Rachel hesitated, not because she doubted the conclusion, but because she understood its impact. Then she spoke. I think this lineage didn't just disappear, she said. I think it adapted. Frank's pulse quickened, and I think she continued her voice steady, now that it passed itself down quietly through generations until it reached someone who could carry it forward without corrupting it. Frank stared at her. And you think that's me? Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another document, one that had remained untouched until now. This is the part most historians ignore, she said. She slid it toward him. Frank read the translated line slowly. The bloodline shall not rise through power, but through loss, so that only the one who has nothing left can carry everything without greed. His hands trembled, because suddenly everything aligned. His life, his losses, the betrayal, the stripping away of everything he had once believed defined him. It hadn't just been suffering. It had been preparation. Frank closed his eyes briefly. A wave of emotion surged through him, grief, anger, disbelief. And beneath it all, understanding. Not complete, not comfortable, but undeniable. When he opened his eyes again, they were different. Clearer, stronger. What happens next? He asked. Rachel met his gaze. And for the first time since they met, there was no hesitation in her answer. Now, she said, we prove it. The results did not stay contained within the quiet walls of Rachel Bennett's research annex. Truth, especially the kind that hinted at power, wealth, or legacy, had a way of moving faster than anyone intended. By the next afternoon, whispers had already begun to circulate in corners of the academic community. Not official reports, not confirmed findings, just fragments, questions, the kind of murmurs that made people curious and sometimes dangerous. Frank Perez did not hear those whispers, but someone else did. Miles away in a sleek apartment overlooking downtown Chicago, Miguel Perez stared at his phone, his jaw tightening as he reread the same message for the third time. You still in touch with your old man? Someone says his name came up in a weird research thing. Something about an artifact. Miguel scoffed under his breath. Research thing, he muttered. He tossed the phone onto the glass table, pacing slowly. For months, he hadn't thought about his father. Not really. Frank had become irrelevant. A problem that had been solved. A loose end that no longer required attention. Or so he believed. But now, something was pulling that thread again. Miguel picked up the phone, scrolling further. Another message. A professor was asking about him. Older guy. Said he found something rare. Rare. That word stuck. Miguel's expression shifted. Not to concern, not to guilt, but to interest. Because Miguel Perez didn't believe in coincidence. And he definitely didn't believe that someone like Frank, his quiet, predictable, easily manipulated father, could suddenly become the center of anything important, unless there was something valuable involved. Back at the annex, Frank sat at the edge of a long wooden table, his hands folded together, the coin resting between them. Rachel moved across the room, organizing documents, preparing files, her mind already racing ahead. We need to verify the genetic link, she said. It's the only way to establish legitimacy. Frank nodded slowly, though the word legitimacy felt foreign in his life. And if it's true, he asked. Rachel paused, then turned to face him. If it's true, she said carefully, then this isn't just history anymore. Frank exhaled. He understood what she wasn't saying. This would change everything. Not just for him, but for others who might want a piece of whatever this legacy represented. Before he could respond, a knock echoed through the hallway, sharp, unexpected. Rachel frowned slightly. I'm not expecting anyone, she said. Frank's body tensed, not out of fear, but instinct. Something about the knock felt wrong. Rachel walked toward the door. When she opened it, she froze. Because standing there was Miguel. Frank didn't see him at first, but he felt it. That subtle shift in the air, the kind that only comes when something unresolved steps back into your life. Rachel Bennett. Miguel asked smoothly. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Yes, she said finally. And you are? Miguel smiled politely. Miguel Perez, he said. I believe you've been working with my father. Frank's heart stopped. For just a moment. Then it started again, slower, heavier. Rachel's eyes flicked briefly toward Frank, then back to Miguel. I didn't realize he had family involved, she said. Miguel's smile widened slightly. Oh, I am, he replied. Very much involved. Frank stood slowly. His body felt older in that moment, not physically, but emotionally. The weight of memory pressed down on him as he took a step forward. Miguel, he said. The name carried years within it. Love, disappointment, pain. Miguel turned his head, and for a brief second, something flickered in his expression. Not guilt, not regret, but recognition. Dad, he said, his tone controlled, measured, as if they had last spoken yesterday, as if nothing had happened. Frank studied him. The same face, the same posture, the same confidence that had once made him proud and later made him uneasy. You found me quickly? Frank said quietly. Miguel shrugged. You'd be surprised what people notice when something valuable is involved, he replied. There it was. Not concern, not relief. Value. Rachel stepped slightly closer to Frank. This isn't a public matter, she said firmly. If you're here to interfere... I'm here because I have a right to be, Miguel interrupted smoothly. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. My father isn't exactly in a position to handle complicated situations like this, he added. Frank felt something shift inside him. Once words like that would have cut deep, would have made him doubt himself. But now they felt different, distant. I'm handling it just fine, Frank said calmly. Miguel glanced at him, surprised. That wasn't the response he expected. Rachel watched closely. She saw it. The difference. Frank wasn't the same man who had been forced out of his home. Not anymore. Miguel's gaze dropped to the coin on the table, and for the first time, his composure cracked, just slightly. So it's true, he murmured. You actually found something. Frank said nothing. Miguel stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the coin. How much is it worth, he asked. The question hung in the air, sharp, revealing. Rachel crossed her arms. That's not the point, she said. Miguel let out a short laugh. Everything has a point, he replied. Especially something that has researchers buzzing. He looked back at Frank. You should have called me, he said. I could have helped you. Frank held his gaze. Helped. The word echoed. Like you helped me before, Frank asked quietly. Miguel's expression hardened. That's not fair, he said quickly. I made decisions based on what was best at the time. For who, Frank asked. Silence. For just a second. But it was enough. Miguel looked away first. Rachel stepped forward again. This conversation isn't productive, she said. Frank is under no obligation to involve you. Miguel smirked slightly. You think this is about obligation, he asked. He gestured toward the coin. This is about opportunity. Frank felt it clearly now. The divide, not just between him and Miguel, but between who he used to be and who he was becoming. You're right, Frank said slowly. Miguel turned back to him. It is about opportunity. A flicker of satisfaction crossed Miguel's face until Frank continued. But not for the reasons you think. Miguel frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Frank stepped forward, placing his hand gently over the coin. It means, he said, his voice steady. Now this isn't something to be taken. He paused. It's something to be understood. Miguel stared at him, confused, frustrated, because this version of his father didn't fit the narrative he had built, didn't behave the way he expected, didn't respond with weakness. You're overthinking it, Miguel said sharply. It's an asset. That's all. Frank shook his head. No, he said. That's what you've always believed. He met his son's eyes. And it's why you lost everything that actually mattered. The words landed harder than anything Frank had ever said before. Miguel's jaw tightened. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. The room fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was clear, defined, because something had shifted. Not in the situation, but in Frank. And Miguel could feel it. even if he didn't understand it yet. Rachel stepped back, slightly observing. She knew this moment mattered, not for the research, not for the coin, but for the man holding it. Frank Perez had just done something he hadn't done in years. He had stood his ground. Miguel exhaled sharply, regaining his composure. "Fine," he said. "Do it your way." But his eyes lingered on the coin, calculating, planning, because if there was one thing Miguel Perez never let go of, it was something he believed belonged to him. And whether Frank realized it or not, this wasn't over. Not even close. Miguel left the annex with a tight smile and a promise that sounded polite on the surface and dangerous underneath. "Call me when you're ready to be practical," he said at the door. Frank didn't answer. He watched his son disappear down the narrow hallway, the echo of his footsteps, fading into the same silence that had swallowed so many moments in Frank's life. Only this time the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a line drawn. Rachel closed the door, locking it with a soft click. "He's not done," she said, turning back. "I know," Frank replied. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded certain. Rachel studied him for a moment, measuring the steadiness in his posture, the clarity in his gaze. The man who had walked into this building yesterday, uncertain, displaced, carrying more loss than direction, had shifted. Not completely, not magically, but undeniably. "Then we move faster," she said. Frank nodded. "Where do we start?" Rachel returned to the table and spread out the documents they had been reviewing. Maps, translations, fragments of old references that most historians had dismissed as incomplete or unreliable. "We follow the markers," she said. "If the coin is a key, it must correspond to something physical. A location, a system." Frank leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the pages. For something meant to stay hidden, he said there has to be a pattern, but not an obvious one. Rachel gave a faint, approving nod. "Exactly." She pointed to a faded map, Southern Europe, centuries old, annotated with hand-drawn symbols that mirrored parts of the coin's crest. "These were believed to be ceremonial territories," she explained, "but most scholars think they were symbolic, not literal." Frank's mind engaged fully, now the teacher within him stepping forward with quiet confidence. "They weren't symbolic," he said. "They were coded." Rachel looked up. "Explain." Frank traced a finger across the map. "Look at the placement," he said. "They're not evenly distributed. They cluster along transitional zones, borders, trade routes, places where identities blur." Rachel leaned in closer. Meaning they weren't marking ownership," Frank said. "They were marking access." Rachel's breath slowed. "That would make them entry points." Frank nodded. "To something that wasn't meant to be found by accident." Silence settled again, but this time it was filled with direction. Rachel pulled out another document, a translated passage they had only skimmed earlier. "Let's revisit this," she said. Frank read along as she spoke. "The legacy shall not be inherited by name alone, but by proof of passage. The one who carries the mark must also find the path." Frank frowned slightly. "Proof of passage?" Rachel looked at the coin. "Then this isn't enough," she said. "It identifies, but it doesn't grant access." Frank considered that. "So there's something else," he said. Rachel nodded. "Or somewhere else." They worked for hours. Time slipped unnoticed as fragments began to align symbols, matching references, patterns, emerging from what once seemed like scattered mythology. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a lost kingdom. It was a system, a deliberately constructed framework designed to survive disappearance. Here, Rachel said, suddenly pointing to a small notation in the corner of a page. Frank leaned closer. It was faint, almost overlooked, but unmistakable. Coordinates, modern ones. His pulse quickened. That's not Europe, he said. Rachel's eyes widened slightly as she cross-referenced it on a digital map. No, she said. She turned the screen toward him. The location resolved into a rural area miles outside the city where the dense urban sprawl gave way to quiet land, forgotten roads, and long stretches of open sky. Why here? Frank asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple. This system adapted, she said finally. If the lineage moved, the markers moved with it. Frank stared at the map. So, whatever this leads to, it's here, Rachel finished. Dusk had already begun to settle when they left the building. The city lights flickered on behind them as they drove out, leaving the crowded streets and familiar noise behind. The further they went, the quieter it became. Buildings thinned. Traffic faded. The skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror. Frank sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed ahead. He wasn't thinking about the city, or Miguel, or even the life he had lost. He was thinking about the words he had read. Proof of passage. What had his life been, if not a passage? Loss after loss. Stripped identity. Silence. Endurance. He had thought those things defined his end. But what if they had been shaping his beginning? They arrived just as the last light of day slipped beneath the horizon. The road narrowed into gravel, then into dirt, until Rachel finally stopped the car near an overgrown stretch of land bordered by trees. "This is it," she said. Frank stepped out slowly. The air felt different here, cooler, quieter, untouched by the constant hum of the city. The kind of place people passed by without noticing, or avoided altogether. Rachel grabbed a flashlight and they moved forward together. The ground was uneven, covered in patches of wild grass and remnants of something older, faded stone. Broken edges, subtle signs that this place had once held purpose. Frank stopped. There he said. Rachel followed his gaze. Half hidden beneath layers of earth and time was a stone marker, worn, cracked, but still standing. She knelt beside it, brushing away dirt carefully. And then they saw it, the same symbol, the crown, the branching crest. Frank's breath caught. "It's real," he whispered. Rachel didn't speak, because in that moment, there was no more doubt. The marker wasn't just a relic. It was a threshold. Rachel ran her fingers along its surface, tracing the lines as if trying to feel the intention behind them. "There has to be a mechanism," she said. "Something that responds." Frank reached into his pocket. The coin. It felt warmer now, as if it had been waiting. He hesitated not out of fear, but out of understanding. This wasn't just discovery anymore. This was entry. He knelt beside Rachel and held the coin near the center of the symbol. For a second, nothing happened. Then a faint click. Soft, subtle, but unmistakable. The ground beneath them shifted slightly. Rachel pulled back instinctively, her eyes wide. "Did you feel that?" Frank nodded. The stone marker trembled just enough to reveal a seam where there had been none before. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's opening." The earth moved with slow resistance as if something long buried was remembering how to breathe again. A narrow gap revealed itself beneath the stone. Dark, hidden, waiting. Frank stared at it. This was it. Not a theory, not a possibility, but truth. And in that truth, he felt something rise within him. Not fear, not doubt, but something he hadn't felt since before everything was taken from him. Purpose. Rachel looked at him. "Are you ready?" she asked. Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at the opening, then at the coin in his hand, then at the life he had left behind. And finally, he stepped forward. Because whatever this legacy was, it had been waiting long enough. The opening beneath the stone marker breathed out a cold ancient air, dry and still untouched by time or memory. It smelled of dust and something deeper, something preserved. Frank Perez lowered himself carefully into the narrow passage, Rachel just behind him, her flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because silence felt appropriate here, reverent. The passage wasn't large, just enough space to move single file. Its walls lined with stone that had been shaped by deliberate hands, not nature. Every few feet, faint markings appeared, variations of the same crest etched into the coin. This wasn't meant to be found by chance, Rachel whispered. Frank nodded. It was meant to be found by someone specific. Her light shifted forward, revealing a wider chamber ahead. They stepped into it slowly and stopped. The room was larger than expected. Not a vault in the traditional sense, no piles of gold, no glittering displays of wealth. Instead, it felt intentional, structured, like a place designed for preservation rather than display. Stone shelves lined the walls, each holding carefully sealed containers, documents and artifacts wrapped in cloth or stored in metal cases. At the center stood a single pedestal, and on it, a box. Simple, wooden, unadorned except for the same crest carved into its lid. Frank's breath slowed. He didn't rush toward it, didn't reach for it immediately, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. This wasn't about possession. It was about responsibility. Rachel moved beside him, her voice low. "This is it," she said. Frank nodded. "I know." He stepped forward. Each movement felt deliberate, as if the room itself was watching, waiting to see what he would do. When he reached the pedestal, he paused. His hand hovered above the box. For a moment, doubt flickered. Not about what this was, but about himself. Am I the right one? The question surfaced naturally, because everything in his life had taught him that he wasn't. Not successful enough, not strong enough, not enough to keep his own son from turning away. But then another thought followed. You lost everything, and you're still here. Frank exhaled slowly, then placed his hand on the lid. The box opened without resistance. Inside there was no gold, no jewels, no visible wealth. Instead, documents, sealed envelopes, ledgers, and a single carefully folded letter placed at the very top. Rachel leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Read it." Frank hesitated for only a second. Then he picked up the letter and unfolded it. The paper was aged but preserved. The handwriting elegant, deliberate. He began to read aloud. To the one who has found this, you were never meant to inherit this through name, nor through power. If you are here, it means you have passed through loss and remained unbroken. Frank's voice faltered slightly. Rachel watched him closely. He continued. This legacy was never about ruling others. It was about protecting something far more fragile, human dignity. The words settled into the space around them. Frank felt them deeply. Those who sought power destroyed themselves. Those who sought wealth lost their way. So we chose another path. He turned the page. We hid what we built, not to protect it from the world, but to protect the world from those who would misuse it. Rachel's eyes moved quickly across the documents in the box, her breath catching. Frank, she whispered. But he kept reading. What remains here is not treasure. It is a network, a foundation, resources placed where they are needed most, waiting for someone who understands what it means to have nothing and still choose to give. Frank's hands trembled, not from age, but from recognition. Because those words, they weren't describing a king, they were describing him. If you have reached this place, then you carry not our name, but our purpose. He stopped. Silence filled the chamber. Rachel spoke first. This isn't a fortune, she said softly. Frank shook his head. No, he replied. It's something bigger. Before either of them could process further, a sound echoed from the passage behind them. Footsteps, sharp, unwelcome. Rachel's body stiffened. Frank turned slowly. And there at the entrance to the chamber stood Miguel. For a moment, no one spoke. The air shifted instantly. What had felt sacred now felt threatened. Miguel's eyes moved quickly around the room, taking in everything, the shelves, the documents, the box. And then they landed on Frank. I knew it, he said quietly. Frank's expression didn't change. You followed us, he said. Miguel smirked. You really think I'd walk away from something like this? He replied. Rachel stepped forward slightly. You shouldn't be here. Miguel ignored her. His attention remained fixed on the box. So this is it, he said. The big secret. He walked closer, his movements confident, entitled. How much, he asked. Frank didn't answer. Miguel's smile faded slightly. I'm serious, he said. What's it worth? Frank looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't see his son. He saw a man driven entirely by what he could take. It's not money, Frank said. Miguel laughed. Everything is money, he replied. You just don't understand how to use it, Rachel's voice cut in. This isn't something you can take control of, she said. Miguel's eyes flicked toward her. Watch me. He stepped forward and reached for the box. Frank moved faster than expected. His hand came down firmly on the lid, stopping Miguel. The movement surprised all of them, especially Miguel. Don't, Frank said. The word wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Authority. Miguel stared at him. You think you can stop me? He asked. Frank held his gaze. I know I can, he replied. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in Miguel's expression. Frustration, anger, desperation. because this wasn't the man he had manipulated. This wasn't the father who had signed papers without question. This was someone else. Someone he didn't control. "You don't even know what you're protecting," Miguel snapped. Frank didn't flinch. "Yes," he said. "I do." He stepped forward, slightly, placing himself fully between Miguel and the box. "It's not wealth," Frank continued. "It's responsibility." Miguel shook his head. "You're making a mistake." Frank's voice softened, but didn't weaken. "No," he said. "I already made that mistake." The words landed harder than anything else, because this time they weren't about the coin or the legacy. They were about Miguel. Silence stretched, heavy, unavoidable. And in that silence, something shifted again. Not in the room, but in Frank. He wasn't reacting anymore. He wasn't defending. He was choosing. And that choice was final. Rachel stepped closer to Frank. "We need to secure this," she said quietly. Frank nodded. Miguel looked between them, realizing perhaps for the first time that he was no longer part of the equation. Not here, not anymore. And that terrified him more than anything. As the tension settled into something sharper, more defined, Frank turned back to the box, not with hesitation, but with clarity, because the truth had revealed itself, not in gold, not in power, but in purpose. And for the first time in his life, Frank Perez understood exactly who he was meant to be. The chamber did not change. The stone walls remained still. The air remained cold. The artifacts sat in quiet, patient rows, as if they had been waiting centuries for a moment exactly like this. But the people inside it, they had changed. Frank Perez stood at the center, hand resting firmly on the wooden box, his posture no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. The man who had once been pushed out of his own home without resistance was gone. In his place stood someone else. Not a king in the traditional sense, but something far more grounded. Someone who understood loss. And because of that, understood value. Miguel could feel it. That shift. And he didn't like it. "This is insane," Miguel muttered, pacing a few steps, running a hand through his hair. "You're standing on something that could change everything, and you're talking about responsibility." Frank didn't respond immediately, because he wasn't reacting anymore. He was choosing his words. Finally he spoke. It already changed everything, he said quietly. Miguel scoffed. "Yeah?" How he shot back. "You're still the same man. Same situation." Frank looked at him, and for the first time, there was no pain in his expression, only clarity. "No," he said. "I'm not." The certainty in his voice unsettled Miguel more than anger ever could. Rachel stepped forward slightly, her gaze steady. "You're looking at this the wrong way," she said. "This wasn't built to be owned. It was built to be continued." Miguel turned sharply toward her. "That's a convenient way to say, no profit," he replied. Rachel didn't flinch. "It's a more accurate way to say no exploitation." Miguel laughed under his breath. "You really believe that," he asked, "that something like this just sits here for centuries, waiting for someone to, what, be kind?" Frank spoke before Rachel could answer. "Yes." Miguel turned back to him. "And that's exactly why you don't understand it," Frank continued. Silence followed, because beneath the surface of that statement was something much deeper, something Miguel couldn't easily dismiss. You always thought value came from what you could take, Frank said. He stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, but firmly. But this, he gestured around the chamber to the documents, the sealed containers, the carefully preserved history. This was built by people who understood that real value comes from what you protect. Miguel's jaw tightened. That's philosophy, he snapped. Not reality? Frank shook his head slowly. No, he said. It's the only reality that lasts. The words hung in the air, heavy, uncomfortable, true. Rachel moved back toward the box, carefully organizing the documents inside. There's more here than we can process in one night, she said. We need to secure everything and begin cataloging. Frank nodded. He understood the scale now. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a system, a network, one that had been designed to operate quietly, efficiently, and most importantly, ethically. Miguel watched them, frustration building. You're just going to leave it here, he asked. For now, Rachel replied, until we understand how to access and distribute it properly. Miguel let out a sharp breath. This is unbelievable. He turned back to Frank. You don't even know what you're sitting on, he said. There could be millions, billions hidden in this network. Frank met his gaze. And if there are, he asked. Miguel stared at him. That's the point, he said. You take control of it. You secure it. You build something real with it. Frank's expression didn't change. It's already real, he said. Miguel shook his head, his voice rising. No, it's wasted, he snapped. Sitting here, unused, hidden. What's the point of that? Frank took a step closer, and this time, his voice carried something new. Not anger, not sadness, but conviction. The point, he said, is that it was never meant for people like you. The words landed hard. Miguel froze. Rachel stopped moving. Even the silence seemed to sharpen. What does that mean? Miguel asked slowly. Frank didn't hesitate. It means it wasn't built for someone who sees everything as an opportunity to take, he said. It was built for someone who knows what it means to lose and still choose to give. Miguel's face tightened. That's your justification, he asked. You think suffering makes you worthy? Frank shook his head. No, he said. It makes you responsible. The distinction cut deeper than any accusation. Because it wasn't about blame, it was about truth. Miguel turned away, pacing again, his movements sharper now. You're making a mistake, he said. A huge one. Frank didn't respond, because for the first time, he didn't feel uncertain. He didn't feel like he needed approval, or validation, or even understanding. He knew what this was, and more importantly, he knew what it wasn't. Rachel stepped closer again. We should go, she said quietly. We've seen enough for now. Frank nodded. He closed the wooden box gently, his hand lingering on the lid for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. Then he stepped back. Miguel watched him, waiting, expecting something, a change of heart, a moment of weakness. But it didn't come. They moved toward the passage, Rachel leading, Frank following. Miguel stayed where he was for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the chamber one last time. calculating, measuring, but something had shifted. This wasn't a simple opportunity anymore. It wasn't something he could just take. Not without crossing a line that couldn't be undone. And deep down, he knew it. As they reached the opening, Frank paused. He turned back. Not to the chamber, but to Miguel. Their eyes met. And in that moment, everything that had been left unsaid between them existed in the space between. Years of expectation, disappointment, distance. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to, because his choice had already been made. They stepped out into the night air. Cool, quiet, real. Rachel exhaled slowly. That changes everything, she said. Frank looked up at the sky, dark, endless, steady. No, he replied. It just revealed what was already there. Rachel glanced at him, and for the first time since this began, she saw him clearly. Not as a subject, not as a discovery, but as someone who had become exactly what this legacy required. Frank reached into his pocket, feeling the weight of the coin again. But it felt different now. Not like a mystery, not like a question, but like a reminder of who he was and what he was meant to do. Behind them, the hidden chamber remained sealed once more, not forgotten, not lost, but protected, waiting, not for power, not for greed, but for purpose. And as Frank Perez walked away from the place that had revealed everything, he understood something that no classroom had ever truly taught him. You don't become a king by claiming a throne. You become one by choosing what to do when the world gives you the power to take and you decide to give instead. The city did not welcome Frank Perez back with applause. Chicago moved as it always had, indifferent, restless, loud, in all the ways that made people feel small. Cars surged through intersections. Strangers passed one another without looking up. Neon lights flickered against windows that reflected lives no one else had time to notice. But Frank didn't need the city to change, because he had. In the days that followed, the hidden chamber remained untouched by the outside world. Not forgotten, not abandoned, but carefully protected. Rachel Bennett worked quietly, methodically, documenting everything they had discovered, cross-referencing the ledgers, decoding the network outlined in the documents, verifying the reach of what had been preserved for generations. And what she found was staggering, not in spectacle, but in intention. The legacy wasn't a vault of riches waiting to be claimed. It was a system already in motion. Anonymous funds routed through small organizations, properties held under obscure trusts, resources quietly directed towards shelters, clinics, community centers, places that operated on the edge of survival, always one step away from collapse. It had been working. All this time, without recognition, without credit, without a name. Rachel brought the findings to Frank one evening as they sat in a small, borrowed office space near the edge of the city. It's everywhere, she said, softly placing the documents in front of him. Not large scale, but consistent, intentional. Whoever built this didn't want attention. They wanted impact. Frank studied the pages. Each line told a story not of wealth, but of need being met quietly. A roof repaired, medical bills covered, food programs sustained just long enough to keep doors open. Small things. But small things change lives. It's already doing what it was meant to do, Frank said. Rachel nodded. Yes, she said. But it's weakening. Some of the channels are breaking down. Without someone maintaining it, it won't last. Frank leaned back slightly, absorbing that. For years, he had believed his life had reached its endpoint, a quiet fade into nothing unnoticed, unremarked. Now, he was being asked to carry something forward, not because he was powerful, but because he understood what it meant to have nothing. A week later, Frank stood in front of a building that had once been closed. Boarded windows, faded paint. A place the city had already given up on. Now the boards were gone. The doors were open. Inside, people moved quietly, purposefully. Volunteers setting up tables. Supplies being unpacked. Conversations beginning where silence had once ruled. At the front, a simple sign had been placed. No grand name, no recognition, just a quiet statement, Community Resource Center. Frank stepped inside. The air felt different here, not heavy, not empty, alive. Raymond Collins stood near the back, directing someone where to place a stack of blankets. When he saw Frank, he paused, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," Ray said, walking over. "You actually did it." Frank smiled faintly. "We did it," he corrected. Ray nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Guess we did." The center wasn't luxurious. It wasn't meant to be, but it was functional, warm, real. A place where people who had been overlooked could walk in without being questioned, judged, or turned away. Frank moved through the space, slowly observing. A woman speaking quietly with a volunteer about housing options. An older man sitting at a table holding a cup of coffee, like it mattered. A young mother unpacking a bag of groceries, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Each moment small, but significant. Rachel approached from the side, a clipboard in her hand. "It's working," she said. Frank nodded. "It always was," he replied. She looked at him. "But now it has direction," she said. Frank didn't answer right away, because direction wasn't something he had always trusted. But now, it felt different, not imposed, not forced, chosen. Across the room, Ray called out, "Hey, Frank, you're gonna want to see this." Frank turned. Ray was standing near the entrance, and beside him was Miguel. For a moment, time seemed to slow, not dramatically, not painfully, just enough for everything unspoken to exist again. Miguel looked different, not completely, but noticeably, less polished, less certain, as if something had unsettled the foundation he had built his life on. Frank walked toward him, steady, calm. "Dad," Miguel said. The word came quieter this time, not controlled, not calculated, just there. Frank stopped a few feet away. "Yes," he replied. Miguel glanced around the center, taking it in. "This is what you did with it?" he asked. Frank followed his gaze. "Yes," he said. Miguel nodded slowly. "I thought you were making a mistake," he admitted. Frank didn't respond, because he had heard those words before. But this time, they sounded different. Miguel looked back at him. "I still don't fully get it," he said. "Why you choose this over everything else?" Frank considered that, then answered simply, "Because I know what it feels like to stand outside with nothing," he said. He paused. "And I know how much it matters when someone opens a door." Miguel's expression shifted, subtly, but enough. For the first time, there was no argument, no justification, just silence. Ray stepped in, breaking the tension slightly. "Well," he said, clapping his hands together, "you gonna stand there all day, or you gonna help?" Miguel blinked. "Help?" he repeated. Ray shrugged. "Yeah," he said. "We got work to do." Miguel hesitated, just for a second. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Okay." Frank watched him move into the room, not as a son returning home, not as someone reclaiming anything, but as a man stepping into something he didn't yet understand. And maybe that was enough for now. As the day unfolded, the center filled, not with noise, but with purpose, conversations, movement, connection. Frank stood near the entrance again, watching it all, not as an observer, but as a part of it. The coin rested in his pocket, not as a symbol of mystery anymore, but as a reminder of where this had begun and what it had revealed. Rachel joined him once more. "You could have taken everything," she said. Frank nodded. "I know. And you didn't." Frank looked out at the room, at the people, at the quiet impact unfolding in real time. "I didn't need to," he said. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware, unchanged. But inside that building, something different existed. Something that didn't rely on recognition or power or control. Something that simply worked. Frank exhaled slowly, not with exhaustion, but with peace. Because after everything he had lost, everything he had endured, everything that had been taken from him, he had found something no one could ever take again. Not a throne, not a title, but something far greater. Purpose. And in that quiet truth, Frank Perez finally understood the world had never needed another king. It needed someone willing to care.